Hey there. Tonight I want to begin with a simple image. A man stands in snow so deep it swallows the tops of his boots, and all around him, the mountains look like great dark animals, asleep beneath the stars. He has no road behind him, no warm town ahead, no kindly inn waiting with stew and blankets. What he does have is an axe, a little strength left in his shoulders, and the unsettling knowledge that if he chooses the wrong patch of ground, or cuts the wrong tree, or leaves one small gap where winter can slip a finger through, the mountain will take him quietly before spring ever thinks of returning. That is the answer hidden inside these old frontier cabins. They were not built because men admired rustic charm, or wanted some picturesque little retreat with smoke curling prettily from the chimney. They were built because cold has a way of stripping romance off a thing until only truth remains. And the truth was simple. If the cabin failed, the man inside it failed too. If you end up enjoying this slow journey into the winter wilderness, leave a like, subscribe, and saddle in with me. I like imagining where people listen from. Some warm city apartment, some rainy roadside motel, maybe somewhere with snow tapping softly at the glass. Tonight, though, we are going much farther out than that. So, get comfortable if you can. Let your shoulders loosen a little. There is no need for ceremony. Just listen to the fire in your mind, and the wind beyond it, and let the old mountains do the rest. The men we call mountain men were not exactly settlers, not in the tidy storybook sense. They were trappers, hunters, fur traders, drifters, sometimes half legend even while they were alive. They followed beaver streams, game trails, rumors of untouched valleys, and the stubborn hope that somewhere beyond the next ridge, a man might carve out a life that belonged only to him. Honestly, I have always found that idea a little strange and a little beautiful. Freedom sounds noble until the first real winter arrives and tries to freeze the thought right out of your skull. Still, they went. They crossed into the American wilderness, where the Rockies rose in stern blue layers and the forests of the Appalachians held their own deep silences. They went where the air grew thin and sharp, where pines crowded close together like watchful witnesses, where snow did not fall so much as gather patiently until the whole world seemed tucked under a white weight. By day, the light flashed on ice and river edges. By night, the dark settled early, and the trees began their long whispering. A man could feel very small there. Small in the honest way. Small enough to understand that the land had been here long before him, and would remain long after his boot prints filled with powder and disappeared. Some of these men came for profit. Fur was money, and money had a pull then, just as it does now, though the beavers probably would have voted against the arrangement if anyone had bothered to ask them. Some came for distance from ordinary life. Some came because they were built for edges, for places where maps grew vague and rules wore thin. Yet whatever brought them in, winter made equals of them. The cold did not care whether a man was ambitious, foolish, brave, lonely, or all four at once. It only cared whether he had shelter before the first true storm closed its white fist. And that is where the story really begins. Not with the finished cabin, not with the cheerful little scene of firelight glowing through a window, but with a man standing in hostile quiet, studying the land as if it might speak. Because out here, choosing where to build was not some decorative first step. It was the first test, and it could not be rushed. Imagine him now, sometime in late autumn, when the ground is hard in the mornings and the streams already wear a thin glaze of ice around their edges. The sky is pale, almost metallic. His breath leaves his mouth in short, cloudy bursts. He has been traveling for hours, perhaps days, looking for a place that feels right. Though right is a slippery word when everything around you is beautiful enough to kill you. He cannot simply drop his pack in the prettiest clearing and declare himself a homeowner. The earth has to be flat enough to hold a structure, but not so flat that spring melt will turn the whole place into a shallow, cold pond. There must be trees nearby, and plenty of them. Straight trunks, if possible, because every wall, every beam, every chance of warmth begins in timber. The ground must be stable. The wind must be studied. The slope above must not threaten to send water, or mud, or heavy snow sliding down onto the roof months later. You know that feeling when one small decision starts to reveal 10 more hidden inside it. It was like that, except the penalty for guessing wrong was a great deal less forgiving than an embarrassing afternoon. Then there was exposure. A valley might look sheltered until the first deep winter wind came knifing through it. A ridge might offer a fine view and excellent misery. A place too open would invite the weather in from every side. A place too dense with trees might keep out wind, but also trap dampness and shadow. And there were other worries too, less poetic, more human. Rival trappers, wandering thieves, tensions with people already living on the land, who understandably did not always greet newcomers with delighted applause. The wilderness was never empty in the way later stories pretended. It was occupied by weather, by animals, by old paths, by older knowledge, and by the quiet fact that one man's refuge might look like an intrusion to another. So the mountain man watched. He walked the same stretch of ground twice, then 3 times. He crouched and pressed his hand to the earth. He looked at how the trees leaned, because trees keep long memories of prevailing wind. He listened to water if there was water nearby. He noticed where snow had drifted early in the season and where it had left bare patches. Perhaps he broke a branch and stood still for a moment, hearing how quickly the sound disappeared into the woods. Silence in such places could be unnerving, but it could also be useful. It let a man hear what mattered. Sometimes, I think this is the part people miss when they imagine frontier life. They picture the dramatic swing of the axe, the log walls rising, the heroic silhouette against sunset. They do not picture the long pause before any of that, the waiting, the measuring with the eyes, the quiet unease of trying to guess how a place will behave in January when you are standing in it in October. But that pause mattered. Maybe it mattered most of all. At last, after enough circling and second-guessing, the man would choose. Not because the spot was perfect. Perfect land is mostly a luxury invented by people selling it. He chose because this patch offered enough, and because daylight was always slipping away, and because winter never once in all of history agreed to delay its arrival for the convenience of a builder. Once the choice was made, the place changed. It stopped being just another fold in the wilderness and became a future shelter, then a burden, then a hope. The man could stand there and begin to imagine walls where there were none, smoke where there was only cold air, a doorway, a roofline, a bed of rough planks, maybe hooks for drying meat, maybe a little shelf for powder, tools, a tin cup. That is another thing I find moving about these cabins. Before they were wood and mud and stone, they were acts of imagination, tiny rebellions against the season ahead. Yet imagination alone did not keep fingers from going numb. The work waited all around him in the form of standing trees, tall pines, sturdy oaks, whatever the region offered. Each one still rooted, still silent, still belonging more to the mountain than to any man. Soon enough, iron would bite into bark, and the calm of the clearing would be broken by the steady old sound of labor. But for one last moment there was only the chosen ground, the pale sky, and the man breathing into his hands, looking at a future that would demand nearly everything he had. Night would come early out here. It always did. The cold would gather in the hollows first, then around the ankles, then higher. Somewhere a branch would creak. Somewhere farther off, something alive would move through brush and snowmelt leaves. He would know, standing there, that shelter was no longer an idea. It was a deadline. And so, with the first place finally chosen, with the silence of the land still hanging around him like a held breath, he turned toward the trees, knowing that every wall of his future cabin was already waiting in the forest, upright and uncut, asking whether he had the strength to bring it down. Before the first tree fell, there were smaller rituals, the sort history tends to skip because they look too ordinary on the page. He would unshoulder his pack with that tired, careful motion people use when every muscle has started to bargain with them. He would check the edge of the axe with his thumb, not enough to cut, just enough to feel whether the blade still held its bite. He might kneel and clear a patch of leaves or old needles with his glove, revealing dark soil underneath, smelling faintly of rot, cold water, and the deep sleep of roots. If there were stones nearby, he would notice them too. Stones meant foundation. Stones meant weight, steadiness, a way of lifting the future floor just enough from the damp breathing earth. And perhaps, for a moment, he would simply stand still and listen to his own body. The little complaint in the back, the soreness in the wrists, the dry pull in the throat from cold air. Out here, fatigue could make a fool of a man faster than ignorance. The mountain men learned this again and again. It is hard to think clearly when you are hungry, harder still when you are cold, and harder than that when the silence presses so close it begins to feel like company. So they paced themselves when they could, though the weather rarely offered kindness, and daylight in late season always seemed to leave too soon, like an unhelpful guest who arrives late and vanishes early. The chosen ground would begin to gather details in his mind. Here the door might face away from the worst wind. Here the hearth might sit, so heat could reach the center of the room, and smoke could be coaxed upward instead of rolling back into his face. Here the bed could be lifted off the floor, because even a few inches matter when cold settles low. It sounds almost domestic when you say it softly like that, but each of those decisions rested on the same old frontier arithmetic. Less draft, more warmth. Less damp, fewer fevers. Less wasted motion, more strength saved for tomorrow. Some men built alone, others had help for a while. A brother, a trapping partner, a passing hand willing to trade labor for food or powder. But even when more than one man stood in the clearing, the loneliness of the job was never far away. A cabin in such country was still an argument with distance. No sawmill humming nearby. No wagon bringing boards. No neat pile of hardware waiting under a tarp. Just forest, weather, tools, and whatever cleverness a person could muster before his fingers went stiff. I think that is why these cabins linger in the imagination. They are humble, yes, often cramped, often smoky, often uglier in reality than modern people like to picture. But humble things can carry immense seriousness. A rough cabin was not trying to impress anyone. It was trying to keep a pulse going until dawn. If you were standing there with me, on that first chosen patch of earth, you might notice how quickly the mind begins to change once shelter becomes possible. The mountains do not look smaller. Exactly. The woods do not become kinder. But the fear starts to rearrange itself. It is no longer the shapeless fear of open exposure. It becomes a list. Cut the trees. Shape the logs. Raise the walls. Seal the cracks. Build the hearth. Gather wood. Keep fire. Find food. Repair everything. Then do it again. There is something almost comforting in that, even if the list is absurdly long. A named trouble is easier to face than a nameless one. Soon, the first chips of wood would fly. Soon, the quiet would be broken. But before that first strike, the clearing still held its cold innocence. A place not yet claimed, only chosen. A place where the future cabin existed in thought alone, fragile as breath in winter air, and just as easily lost if the man standing there proved too slow, too weak, or simply unlucky. Morning comes thin and gray in the mountains, the sort of light that does not so much arrive as slowly reveal what the cold has already claimed. The man wakes stiff, or perhaps he never fully slept at all. Either way, the chosen clearing waits for him, silent and expectant, and now there is no more time for considering where the cabin ought to stand. Now the land must be persuaded, cut, shaped, and lifted into walls before winter decides discussion is over. The first true labor is timber. Every frontier account seems to carry the echo of it. The axe striking, the trunk answering, the long, patient rhythm of effort repeated until the tree begins to tremble with its own surrender. No chainsaw, no cheerful machine, no quick mechanical mercy. Just iron, wood, breath, and the ache that spreads from the palms into the shoulders and all the way down the spine. It is work so physical that it narrows the mind. After a while, there is only the next swing, the slight sting where the handle rubs the skin, the sting becoming warmth, then numbness, then something beyond complaint. The best trees were usually the straight ones. Pine, if the region offered enough of it. Cedar, oak, whatever could be cut, moved, and trusted. Pine was valued for its height and length, though sticky sap had its own inconveniences, especially in the cold. Oak was heavier, slower to handle, but stubbornly dependable. The mountain man could not afford to be sentimental about species. He used what stood closest, strongest, and most useful. Wilderness architecture is not a delicate art. It is the art of asking, very firmly, what can hold? He would study each tree before cutting. Lean, thickness, branch spread, distance from the others. A tree falling badly could crush tools, crack against neighboring trunks, or simply waste precious energy. So he made his first notch with care. Chips flew pale against the darker bark. The smell rose at once, clean and resinous, the raw scent of opened wood. Honestly, I have always found that smell unsettling and comforting at the same time. It is the smell of life interrupted, and also the smell of shelter beginning. The sound, too, had its own strange character. The axe did not merely strike. It bit. It lodged. It jarred. It rang through the handle into bone. Then came the repeated blows, steady, not theatrical, not heroic in the storybook sense, just necessary. If you listen closely in your mind, you can almost hear the pace of it now. Strike. Breathe. Strike. Shift the feet in the snow or damp leaves. Strike again. Somewhere above, a raven might complain, like an old man being inconvenienced. Somewhere farther off, wind moved through higher branches with a hush like water over stone. At last, the trunk would begin to speak back in a different tone. Agron. A small pop from deep inside the fibers. The change in weight. The unmistakable warning that the tree was no longer entirely itself. Then the fall. Not graceful, not always clean. Sometimes a rush of needles, a snapping of limbs. A crash so large it seemed impossible one man had caused it. The forest would go still afterward in a way that felt almost offended. And then came the less romantic part, which is saying something, because there was not much romance to begin with. A fallen tree is not yet a wall. It is still a burden lying in the cold, heavy and awkward, bark rough with frost, branches jutting in all directions like accusations. Limbs had to be cut away. The trunk had to be measured by eye, trimmed to useful length, cleared of what would not serve. Every stroke cost energy. Every pause risked losing heat in numbing hands. This is where frontier stories often become very selective. They admire the finished cabin, but pass quickly over the fact that moving logs is miserable work. There is no elegant way to say it. Wood is heavy in the stubborn way only natural things can be. It does not care that you are tired. It does not care that your back is already complaining. It certainly does not leap eagerly into place because a narrator needs a smoother scene. It must be rolled, dragged, levé, shifted a few inches at a time, sometimes over packed earth, sometimes over roots, sometimes through snow that soaks the boots and makes each step feel like an argument. Still, little by little, the clearing changed. Cut trunks gathered where standing trees had been. The future cabin began to exist not just in the mind now, but in a rough, scattered inventory on the ground. Here were the walls, though no one yet called them that. Here was the ridge beam, perhaps. Here were shorter pieces for the lower courses, maybe for door framing, maybe for some later repair not yet imagined. All around lay the evidence of labor: bark strips, chips, trampled needles, fresh stumps pale and raw as if the forest had been shaved. Before walls could rise, there had to be some sort of base. Not always a grand foundation, not in the modern sense, but enough to keep the cabin from sinking, shifting, or drawing too much damp from the earth. Stones were useful if the land offered them, large ones especially, dragged and levered into place with grunts that vanished into the trees. Where stone was scarce, heavier logs could help form the base. The point was simple: lift the structure, give it steadiness, make sure the future floor would not become a sponge in wet seasons and an ice tray in cold ones. So the man worked at ground level first, and there is something almost touching about that. All future comfort begins with bending low in the dirt. He set the stones. He checked them by eye. He stepped back. He nudged one again because it was not right. He crouched, stood, crouched once more. A badly set base meant trouble later, and trouble later, in a mountain winter, had a nasty habit of arriving when a man was already too exhausted to solve it elegantly. Once the base felt sound enough, the real craft began. Notching. Now there is a quiet beauty in notching, though beauty may not have been the word a freezing builder used at the time. Each log had to meet the next in a way that was both strong and intimate. Too shallow a notch, and the log would sit poorly, leaving drafts and instability. Too deep, and the timber weakened, robbed of its strength. So the ends were marked by eye, or by experience, then cut with axe and saw into shapes that would lock together when stacked. Crude, perhaps, by polished standards, but precise in the only way that mattered. Precise enough to hold. I have always liked this part of the story because it reveals the hidden patience inside rough people. Mountain men are often remembered as hairy, weather-beaten creatures of appetite and stubbornness, and I am sure many of them were. But a good notch requires attention. It asks the hand to slow down. It asks the eye to measure carefully. It asks a man, even when cold and hungry, not to rush. The wilderness rewarded speed now and then, but cabin building usually preferred deliberation. One bad notch could haunt every day that followed. Picture him kneeling beside a log, one glove off perhaps, fingers tracing the cut. The light has shifted since morning. The air smells of sap, split wood, and the faint mineral scent of turned earth. Somewhere near his boot lies a shaving of bark curled like a ribbon. He lifts the axe again, cuts a little more, tests the fit, mutters under his breath, maybe says something impolite to the log itself. I hope he did. A bit of muttering feels historically appropriate. Then comes the lift, or the heave, or the awkward levering of one log onto another. The first course goes down, then the second, then the next. Slowly the shape rises, not enough yet to promise safety, but enough to suggest enclosure. Enough that the eye begins to read boundary where before there was only open clearing. This is an important emotional change. Outside and inside are being invented at the same time. That may sound overly poetic for a pile of timber, but it is true. Until the walls begin to rise, a man belongs entirely to the weather. After that, even before the roof, he can start to imagine resistance. The cabin had to be small enough to warm. That mattered greatly. A huge room might flatter the ego and freeze the occupant. Better a modest space where heat from the hearth could gather and linger. Yet it also had to be large enough for movement, for sleeping, for drying gear, for storing tools and food, perhaps for 2 men, perhaps a family, if fortune or misfortune had arranged such a thing. Every frontier cabin was therefore an exercise in compromise. Not too wide, not too low, not too ambitious, not too crude, just enough. The entire history of winter survival could probably be summarized as humanity repeatedly trying to achieve just enough before the sky turns unkind. As the hours passed, the logs stacked higher, one corner locked into another. The joined ends began to resemble a puzzle made not for elegance but for endurance. Gaps still showed between the logs, of course. Dark seams where the future wind would love to whisper. But that problem would come later. For now, strength came first. Weight. Balance. The simple miracle of wood staying where it was put. With each added course, the mountain man had to look upward more often. He had to judge whether the walls were staying true, whether one side had begun to wander out of line, whether a log had twisted slightly as it dried or settled. There were no laser levels, no neat kits, no helpful pamphlet titled "How Not to Build Your Own Frozen Coffin." There was only experience, or borrowed experience, and the stubborn intelligence of the hands, and all the while winter kept breathing down his neck. This is what makes the whole business feel almost holy to me, in a plain, rough way. Not holy because it was grand, but because it was exacting. Because every lifted log held the quiet weight of tomorrow inside it. Every corner joint was a promise made in advance to some future night of hard wind. Every piece of work said, when the snow comes harder, when the fire burns low, when the dark presses close. May this hold. By late day, the clearing no longer looked like wilderness interrupted. It looked like the beginning of a home, though home is a generous word for something roofless and raw. Still, the difference mattered. There were walls now high enough to cast shadows of their own. There was the suggestion of a doorway. There was a space in the middle where a man could stand and feel, if only briefly, that the land had yielded one small square of itself. He would be exhausted by then, arms trembling slightly, back tight, beard or collar carrying wood dust and flecks of bark. The kind of tired that turns the evening air strange and almost dreamy. Yet, I suspect there was satisfaction too. That deep frontier satisfaction which came not from ease, but from visible progress. The wall had been lower in the morning. Now it was higher. The tree had stood. Now it held one corner of the future. In a world as uncertain as this one, tangible improvement was its own kind of comfort. Still, the work was far from done. The walls, however sturdy, could not yet keep out a mountain night. Not really. The seams between the logs waited to be sealed. The roof still belonged to imagination. The hearth was not built. Fire, the true heart of the place, had not yet been given its chamber. But the structure had begun, and beginnings matter more than we sometimes admit. As dusk pressed into the trees, the man might step back one last time and study what he had raised. The sky above the unfinished walls would already be dimming toward iron blue. The first stars might appear, cold and remote. In the clearing, the smell of cut wood lingered richly. Chips lay scattered underfoot. The half-built cabin stood quiet, a rough, dark outline against the pale season. Not beautiful, perhaps, not in any polished way, but deeply convincing. You could stand inside those rising walls and hear the wind differently now. Not silenced, not yet, but interrupted, broken slightly by timber, bent around corners newly made by human effort. That small change, that slight dulling of the world outside, must have felt enormous. And tomorrow, or the next day, the builder would kneel with mud, clay, moss, and whatever else he could gather to begin the softer, focia, life-saving work of sealing the cabin against the cold. The heavy bones were in place. Next came skin, breath, warmth, and the long, quiet struggle to make a rough wooden shell hold back winter. Morning returned with a pale, careful light, and the half-built cabin stood in the clearing like a thought that had finally taken shape but was not yet ready to trust. The walls were up high enough now to mark a real inside from a real outside. That alone changed something in a man. Even unfinished shelter has a way of softening panic. Still, the mountain man would have known better than to grow sentimental too early. A wall with gaps is only a polite suggestion to the wind, and the wind in the high country was rarely polite. It came down the slopes with its own hard mind, slipped through timber, searched corners, tested every weakness. It did not need a grand opening. It needed only a seam no wider than a finger, a little dark crack between logs, and it would begin its work. It would carry cold into blankets, into boots, into sleeping bones. It would turn a shelter into a drafty trap and a long night into a lesson a man might not survive twice. So once the heavy work of felling, dragging, and stacking logs had been done, a quieter kind of labor began. Less dramatic, perhaps, but no less serious. The work of sealing. The mountain man moved along the walls, one section at a time, crouching, leaning close, studying every line where one log met another. In the bright outside air, those seams might seem manageable. In a January dark, they would feel like invitations to misery. So he went looking for what the land could offer. Clay, if he could find it, was a gift. Mud, too, though not all mud was equal. Some held together with satisfying stubbornness. Some crumbled once it dried, as if offended by the responsibility. Moss was valuable, especially the thick, damp kind that could be pressed into crevices and hold there. Animal hair helped. Straw, if any, was to be had. Shreds of bark sometimes. The mountain men borrowed these methods in part from what they observed around them, including techniques long used by native peoples who understood very well that a warm shelter depends as much on what fills the gaps as on what forms the wall. Frontier survival was full of borrowing, though later stories often preferred to pretend everything came springing fully formed from the rugged genius of one lonely man with an axe. The truth was always messier, and usually more interesting. So picture him now near a patch of wet ground, perhaps along a bank where the soil had a heavier body to it, digging into cold earth with a tool, with hands, with whatever he had. The mud would be dark and slick, the clay denser, almost silky beneath the crust of chill. He would gather it into a bucket if he had one, into a hide, into any container fit for hauling. Moss would be scraped from stones or tree bases in damp green handfuls. It had that deep woodland smell, earthy and cool, like the forest floor keeping secrets. By the time he carried it back, his gloves or fingers would be stained, his boots caked, his patience already being tested by work that did not look impressive from a distance, and yet might matter more than the walls themselves. Back at the cabin, the filling began. He would press the first material into the seam between logs with his thumbs, with a stick, with the flat of a knife handle, with patience that bordered on stubbornness. It had to go deep enough to stay, tight enough to resist the drying pull that would come later, and broad enough to close the opening against wandering air. This was not elegant work. It was damp, cold, a little miserable, and absolutely essential. The mud chilled the skin. The moss clung in vet strands. Clay dried under the nails. And still, he went on, inch by inch, around the cabin. He was not conquering the wilderness now. He was tucking the cabin closed, teaching it how to hold warmth. One seam, then the next. One little weakness noticed and filled before it could become a larger one. The walls were becoming less like stacked timber and more like a body meant to keep life inside it. Some mountain men likely mixed materials as they worked. Moss deep in the gap, clay packed over it, a little hair or fiber to help bind things together. Others used what they had and hoped for the best. That phrase, hoped for the best, appears in the background of much early frontier life, though I suspect nobody actually said it with a cheerful smile. Hope out there was not decorative. It was practical, often muddy, and generally accompanied by blisters. As the hours passed, the cabin changed again. At first, the dark seams had cut sharp lines through the walls. Now they softened. The logs looked more united, less like separate pieces reluctantly piled together, and more like a structure learning its own purpose. The smell inside shifting too. Fresh wood was still there, resinous and clean, but now it mingled with wet earth, crushed moss, and the faint sourness of damp material drying in cold air. Of course, the roof was always a problem. A quiet one at first, then an urgent one the moment snow began to collect. A bad roof could sag, leak, or simply surrender under weight. A good one had to shed what it could, bear what it must, and do all this without wasting too much time or material in the building. So beams had to be set, smaller poles laid across, covering added according to region and means, bark, split boards, packed earth in some cases, whatever could create enough barrier between a man and the cold sky pressing down. The mountain man might climb awkwardly, boots slipping against fresh wood, breath smoking around his face. He might test each beam with the sole of his foot before trusting it. Below him, the unfinished interior waited. Around him, the trees stood indifferent. Above him, the sky had that washed-out look that suggests weather is always thinking. Still, timber met timber overhead, and the outline closed in. The moment a roof begins to exist, even before it is fully sealed, a cabin starts to feel less temporary. Sound changes under it. The air changes. A man standing beneath those rough beams would hear the outside world with slightly more distance now, as if the mountain had been persuaded to step back one careful pace. Then came the hearth. This part matters so much that it almost deserves to be spoken more softly. Fire in these cabins was not a pleasant extra. It was the living center around which everything else arranged itself. Warmth, cooking, drying clothes, preserving some food, boiling water, light after dark, comfort for the mind as much as the body. All of it led back to flame. Without a hearth, a cabin was merely an enclosure. With one, it might become a home, or at least the closest harsh winter could allow. Building that hearth was no simple matter. Stone was best when it could be gathered. Clay helped bind it. The base had to be secure enough to bear heat without setting the whole place on an unhelpful and very final sort of illumination. A fireplace too large wasted effort. Too small, and it failed the room. The chimney or smoke vent had to draw well enough to pull fumes outward instead of rolling them back into the cabin where they could sting the eyes, choke sleep, and turn every meal into a coughing fit. So the mountain man gathered stones, one at a time perhaps, or several in a load if strength allowed. He bent, lifted, carried, set them down, rearranged them, frowned, tried again. Big stones for the lower course, if possible. Flatter ones where the shape allowed. Clay packed between them. Hands blackened. Wrists sore. Knees stiff from kneeling on rough ground. The sort of labor that is very nearly invisible once finished, and yet absolutely unforgettable while doing it. The way he would look from stone to wall, from wall to roofline, deciding how smoke might travel, how sparks might behave, how close heat should come to timber. There is expertise in such decisions, though it rarely announced itself with formal language. No one stood there saying, "I shall now apply thermal management principles." He just knew, or learned badly once and remembered forever after. At last, with the hearth shape, with the surrounding area cleared as best he could, with enough faith placed in earth and stone and his own judgment, the moment came that all the earlier labor had been moving toward. The first fire. Think of how still the cabin must have felt before it. Damp seams drying in silence. raw wood all around, air cold enough to carry the smell of earth sharply. Then the quiet ritual of kindling. Scraps of dry material, small twigs, a little nest of fuel laid with care. Flint and steel, perhaps, or embers brought forward if he was fortunate enough to have them. The first spark is always smaller than the hope pinned to it. That seems true in life generally, and especially true in winter. But then it catches. A faint crackle first. A tiny thread of smoke. Flame touching one edge of bark or shaving and then another. The smallest orange life opening in the dimness. He would lean close, shielding it, feeding it carefully, not rushing, because a greedy fire can die just as quickly as a neglected one. The smell would change once more. Damp earth giving way to wood smoke. Resin sweetening in the heat. A little warmth loosening the room. Not much at first, just enough to be noticed on the face and hands. Yet that little was enormous. The flames would cast unsteady light over the new walls, touching the mud packed into seams, the rough grain of the logs, the tools lying nearby. Shadows would move. The cabin would no longer feel like a shell abandoned to cold. It would feel inhabited, even if by only one exhausted soul and a modest fire trying bravely to prove a point. Smoke might still misbehave at first. Some fireplaces surely smoked terribly until adjusted. Drafts had to be learned. Openings widened or narrowed. Stones shifted. The mountain men were builders. Yes, but they were also constant revisers. Wilderness does not often reward the belief that the first attempt will be perfect. It prefers adaptation. It enjoys humbling confidence. It has a dry sense of humor that way. So perhaps he coughed. Perhaps tears sprang into his eyes from a smoky swirl, and he muttered something sharp at the chimney. Perhaps he sat back on his heels, face reddened by the heat on one side and chilled by lingering drafts on the other, thinking that the cabin was still a long way from comfortable, and he would have been right. But comfort was never the first goal. Survival was. Anything gentler than that came later, in moments, and had to be earned repeatedly. As evening lowered itself across the clearing, the little fire in the hearth would go on speaking in its own soft language. Pop, crackle, settle, breathe. Outside, the wind could move through the trees with all its old confidence. Inside, though, something new had appeared. Not victory. That would be too large a word, and the mountain would only smirk at it. But resistance. A center of warmth. A place where the dark might be endured rather than merely suffered. And it is worth remembering that this, too, was part of the mountain man's craft. He was not just stacking wood and mud. He was shaping an interior world. A small one. A smoky one. Often cramped. Often imperfect. Probably never as charming as modern people imagine while sipping something hot and expensive. But real. Useful. Alive. By the time night settled fully, the cabin would still need work. There would still be weak seams to fill, small drafts to hunt down with the back of a hand, roof edges to inspect, damp places to watch. Yet the essential transformation had begun. A man could sit near that first hearth and feel the cold held back, if only by a little. Soon enough, other needs would press forward. Firewood in greater quantity. Food. Maintenance. Sleep. More repairs than anyone ever finished. The wilderness was generous with tasks. But tonight, the cabin had crossed some invisible boundary. It was no longer merely under construction. It was beginning to keep a human being alive. And that made all the difference. Once the hearth had proven itself and the walls began, at last, to hold a little warmth, the mountain man met the next truth of winter life, and it was a stubborn one. Building a cabin was not the end of the trouble. It was simply the form the trouble took before the real daily struggle began. Shelter could keep out the wind for a few hours. It could not, by itself, keep a fire alive, fill an empty belly, or stop snow from returning with fresh ideas. So the rhythm of survival settled in. Morning was usually claimed first by the fire. That was sensible, almost sacred in its practicality. A cabin in deep cold changed quickly once the flames died down. Warmth fled faster than a man wanted to admit. The air turned sharp again. The floor hardened with chill, and the little comforts of the night retreated to the red glow of embers crouched low in the hearth. He would rise stiffly from bed or blanket, breath already showing pale in the cabin air, and kneel by the ashes with the attention of someone greeting a fragile ally. A man bent forward in the half-light, easing together a few small sticks, blowing gently, watching for that delicate, brightening deep in the ash. A pulse, a response, then the faint crackle of kindling taking, a little ribbon of smoke, a warmer color spreading outward. The first flame of morning must have felt like forgiveness. Once the fire was going, the room changed by degrees. Not instantly, never generously, but enough. The stone of the hearth began to hold heat again. Damp gloves might be set nearby. A kettle, if there was one, could be placed close. Frozen stiffness in the fingers eased a little. The cabin, which in the darkest hours before dawn could feel like a wooden box perched at the edge of nowhere, became livable once more. But fire was greedy. That was its nature. It gave comfort and demanded fuel, endlessly. So the woodpile mattered nearly as much as the hearth itself. Perhaps more on certain mornings. A man might have enough food for the day and still die miserably if he had misjudged his stock of dry timber. That is why the work of gathering and cutting wood never really stopped. It did not belong only to the building stage. It followed through every day of winter like a stern creditor, returning each morning with the same expression. He would go out into the cold, axe in hand, sometimes before full daylight, when the world was still blue and silver and painfully still. Snow would crunch under his boots with that dry sound unique to hard cold, crisp and almost glassy. The trees would stand in patient ranks around him, dark trunks rising from white ground. There was beauty there, of course. There always was. But beauty in the wilderness had an annoying habit of arriving beside hard labor, as if determined not to let anyone enjoy it lazily. He gathered deadfall when he could, split larger rounds when he had to, dragged branches, cut manageable lengths, stacked them with care because wet wood smoked badly, and badly burned wood meant wasted effort. and a cabin full of eye-watering disappointment. The mountain men understood fuel intimately. Green wood hissed. Resin-rich pieces flared fast. Dense hardwood held heat better, but demanded more from the body to cut and haul. Every pile by the cabin door represented hours of labor carried in on sore shoulders. And while the fire asked to be fed, the body made its own claims. Hunger arrived steadily in the cold. Not dramatic at first, just a background pulling sensation. Then something sharper if ignored. The mountain man could not rely on markets or convenient deliveries or the sort of cheerful village life that makes some historical paintings look suspiciously comfortable. If he wanted food, he had to go into the land and negotiate with it directly. Hunting was one way, of course, and perhaps the most obvious one. Larger game, deer if the region and season allowed, maybe elk in some places, smaller animals when fortune narrowed. Yet hunting in winter is not simply a matter of walking into the woods and returning nobly with supper slung over one shoulder. The animals were not waiting in cooperative little groups discussing who would volunteer. They moved according to weather, scarcity, instinct, and the old serious business of staying alive themselves. So the mountain man had to read signs. Tracks pressed into snow. Broken twigs. Scat. The marks of feeding. The way a slope held sun. The way wind carried scent. The places where animals passed, from shelter to water, or from brush to open ground. It was a patient art, half knowledge and half listening. He learned to go quietly, to pause more than he walked, to let the woods settle around him after each movement. A wrong sound, a careless step on crusted snow, and the chance might dissolve at once into trees and distance. The rifle, if he had one, brought its own demands. Powder kept dry. Shot measured. Aim steady despite cold fingers. And there was no room for waste. A missed shot was not just disappointment. It was hunger postponed, energy spent for nothing. Perhaps even a dangerous noise announcing his presence in country where he preferred to remain unannounced. That is why trapping mattered so much. Traps worked while a man worked elsewhere, at least in theory. In reality, they required their own cycle of effort. Setting, checking, resetting, cursing softly when they failed, trying again. Snares for rabbits, deadfalls where practical. More elaborate trap lines, if a man had time. Chill, and the sort of determined optimism frontier life seemed to breed out of sheer necessity. Smaller game might not look impressive laid beside the idea of a noble stag, but a rabbit in hand is wonderfully persuasive when the cold has chewed through your appetite and the snow has been falling for days. So imagine the line of traps winding through the forest. Not dramatic, not ceremonial. Just a quiet chain of little hopes placed carefully along animal paths. The mountain man moves among them with measured steps, breath drifting ahead of him. Some mornings a trap lies empty, snow dusted lightly over its mechanism, as if the night itself had shrugged and moved on. Some mornings it has sprung for no useful reason at all, which must have inspired language too impolite for most diaries. And some mornings, rarely enough to stay serious, there is success. The relief in such a moment must have been immediate and deeply physical. Not joy exactly, not the luxurious kind. More a settling, a loosening in the chest. Food. Fur. Another day made possible. And every piece mattered. The wilderness did not encourage waste. Meat fed the body. Hide might line a glove, patch a blanket, trade later, or serve some humble domestic purpose no one would ever write songs about. Bonus, sinew, fat, all had uses in a world where throwing something away was a gesture of luxury. Survival often means becoming less delicate in your definitions of usefulness. Back at the cabin, food brought more work rather than less. Meat had to be cleaned, portioned, preserved when possible. The mountain men smoked and dried what they could, salted what they could afford to salt, used cold itself as a crude partner in storage. A carcass might be kept in snow or in a sheltered place where freezing air performed the blunt miracle of preservation. Fish, when available, could be dried or smoked. Roots stored in cool earth before winter deepened. Herbs hung if anyone had thought ahead, and thinking ahead was a talent winter, rewarded with unusual enthusiasm. The cabin itself participated in all this. Meat might hang from rafters. Herbs or skins might dry where warmth reached them. The air inside would carry layers of scent. Smoke, fresh split wood, damp wool, animal hide, earth packed in the seams, perhaps a broth thickening near the coals, perhaps the sharper note of fat heating in a pan if fortune had been kind. Not exactly refined living. But refinement was never the point. Continuity was. Making tomorrow possible. Then the next day. Then one more after that. And all the while, maintenance continued. Because the cabin was not some finished masterpiece to be admired from a rocking chair. It was a structure under constant negotiation with cold, wind, and weight. Snow gathered on the roof. Seams shifted as logs dried or settled. Chinking loosened. The door swelled or shrank. Smoke sometimes refused to behave. Water found its sly ways where a man least wanted it. Each morning's warmth had to be defended all over again. You can almost see him moving around the cabin with a practiced eye now. Hand pressed near a wall to feel for a draft. Shoulder against the door to test its fit. Gaze lifted toward the roofline after a storm. A quick check at the base logs where damp and thaw could cause trouble in milder spells. Little repairs done whenever possible, because little repairs neglected have a wicked talent for returning in the middle of the worst weather. Rise. Fire. Wood. Check weather. Check traps. Hunt if needed. Repair what loosened. Return before light fades. Feed fire. Eat. Listen. Sleep lightly. Repeat. Yet within that rhythm there were moments of real calm. A bowl of hot food near the hearth after hours in the snow. Boots steaming faintly beside the fire. Shoulders easing as warmth returns. The low domestic sounds of a cabin at evening. A knife set down on wood. A kettle beginning to murmur. The fire settling deeper into its bed of coals. Outside, the storm may move through the trees with a long animal voice. Inside, there is just enough order to hold the dark at bay, not merely in their construction, though that mattered enormously, but in the life they made possible once built. Every log was part of a system. Every sealed seam, every armload of fuel, every trap line, every smoked strip of meat. The cabin was not a static thing. It was the center of an ongoing pattern of effort. Remove one part, and the others trembled. Let the fire fail, and comfort vanished. Let the food stores thin too far, and the body weakened. Let maintenance slide, and the wind found its way back in with smug efficiency. Even so, the mountain men kept going. Not because they were made of sterner material than everyone else, though some were certainly hard enough to make conversation with them feel like talking to an oak stump. They kept going because there was no elegant alternative. You either adapted or you were adapted by the wilderness. And the wilderness was not known for gentleness in those negotiations. Some evenings, after the day had gone about as well as could be hoped, a man might sit close to the fire and feel almost wealthy. Not in coins, not in comfort by ordinary standards, but in necessities visibly secured. Wood stacked, food hanging, rifle dry, traps reset for morning, roof intact, smoke drawing well enough. In such moments, the cabin must have seemed less like a desperate shelter and more like a small fortress of competence. Then, of course, the wind would rise again, or the snow begin, or a trap line produce nothing for 2 straight days, and the fortress would reveal its usual frontier honesty. Temporary, hard-won, always one storm away from demanding fresh labor. But that was life there. Not ease, not certainty, just the steady, serious accomplishment of getting through one more day with warmth in the hearth and enough strength left to face another. By night, the fire burned lower, and the mountain man would settle closer to it, letting the light move over walls he had raised with his own hands. He could hear the weather beyond the cabin. You could hear the old, deep wilderness continuing exactly as it pleased. But now there was an answer to it. Not a loud answer. Not a triumphant one. Just this. A roof. A hearth. A little food. A little warmth. A man still alive in the middle of winter, which is no small thing. And while the flames breathed softly against stone, he would know what tomorrow required before tomorrow even arrived. More wood, more vigilance, more patience, more trust in his own labor. Because survival here was never won once. It had to be renewed daily, fed like the fire itself, one careful act at a time. By the time the cabin had settled into its winter shape, with the hearth breathing steadily and the walls no longer feeling like a rough experiment, another truth would have pressed itself forward with patient insistence. Warmth alone could not carry a man through a mountain season. Fire might guard the blood for a night, but food guarded the future, and the future in those places had to be prepared long before hunger became visible. This is the quieter side of survival, and in some ways the more demanding one. A tree can be felled in an afternoon. A wall can rise over a stretch of hard labor. But provision, real provisions, require foresight, repetition, and the sort of calm discipline that does not look dramatic by candlelight. The mountain men learned quickly that winter punished laziness with unusual creativity. If food was not gathered before the deep cold arrived, it would not politely wait nearby until a man felt ready. So much of the winter meal began in the season before winter itself. In the fall, while rivers still moved freely and the woods had not yet closed under heavy snow, there was a gathering of chances. Game was hunted with more urgency. Fish were taken where they could be. Roots were dug. Herbs, berries, and whatever the land could spare were brought in, sorted, stored, dried, smoked, salted, or hung. A man did not simply think about supper. He thought about the long corridor of coming weeks, when the sky would shut down the easier routes and the forest would offer less with every storm. I have always found that part strangely moving. The mountain man preparing for winter was not only feeding himself, he was feeding a future version of himself that he might not yet fully believe in. He was stacking meat for the week when the trapline failed. He was drying herbs for the fever that might arrive in January. He was burying roots for a storm not yet visible. There is tenderness in that, though it comes dressed in smoke and animal hide rather than anything soft. When game was brought down, the work had only begun. Meat had to be cut with care, not just hacked apart in haste. Good strips for drying, thicker pieces for immediate use. Fat saved if possible. Hide set aside. Bones considered for broth or tools. The cabin, or the space just outside it under some rough shelter, became a workshop of preservation. Thin slices of meat might be salted if salt was available enough to spare. Often they were smoked or dried over time, sometimes near the hearth, sometimes in colder moving air where the slow work of winter itself could help. Picture those strips hanging now, darkening gradually above a gentle line of smoke. The air is rich with it. Resin from the firewood mingling with the heavier scent of meat curing in slow warmth. The rafters begin to look less bare. A few bundles hang from pegs. A hide dries stiffly in the corner. Somewhere near the wall there may be roots tucked into a crate, a pit, a barrel if the man was fortunate enough to have one, or simply buried outside, where the earth stayed cool and stable under packed soil. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, whatever the region and opportunity allowed. Not abundance exactly, but enough to keep the body from turning desperate too soon. Herbs mattered more than they are sometimes given credit for. A little flavor in a winter stew could lift the spirit, and the spirit was not some decorative extra in such a life. It was a working part of endurance. Dried leaves crushed between cold fingers. The smell rising briefly, green and sharp, almost like memory itself. You can imagine the comfort of that on a night when the wind had been scraping at the walls for hours and the dark had arrived before a man quite felt ready for it. Berries or fruit, if preserved, were rare blessings. They brought sweetness into a season that otherwise tended toward salt, smoke, fat, and whatever hardness necessity required. I suspect such stores disappeared quickly if a man was not careful. Self-control is harder in winter, especially when everything outside the door is white, silent, and trying to convince you that pleasure no longer exists. But food in the wilderness was never just about what had been stored. It was also about what could still be found. Hunting continued when conditions allowed. Trapping became even more important, not because it was glamorous, but because it worked often enough to matter. The line of snares and deadfalls across the woods might bring in rabbits, squirrels, occasionally beaver in some country, birds if fortune bent kindly, not lavish eating, practical eating, the kind that keeps the hands steady and the mind from wandering too far into weakness. And still, there were lean spells, days when the traps stood empty and the snow swallowed all obvious sign, days when the sky hung low and gray, making the whole wilderness feel as if it had drawn a blanket over its face and refused conversation. On such days, the stored food mattered most. A strip of smoked meat cut thin into a pot, a handful of roots, maybe a bit of dried herb, maybe nothing more than broth and heat. It would not be a meal praised in any city dining room, but it would be warm, and warm food in winter has a way of persuading the body to continue. The cabin changed with these stores. It stopped being only a shelter and became a little archive of labor. Meat from the hunt weeks ago, wood cut before the last storm, herbs gathered under autumn sun now waiting in the dark season. Every object in the room began to carry time inside it. This, too, had always interested me about those cabins. They were full of delayed effort. A man sat among the proof of his own planning, eating the past in order to survive the future. Yet planning never erased uncertainty. That is important. The mountain men could prepare well and still be caught short. A long storm might keep them inside. Damp could spoil something that had seemed safe enough. A predator might steal from a cache. A rifle might fail at the wrong moment. Illness could reduce a week's work to nothing. We should be careful not to turn their survival into some neat mechanical system where effort always equals reward. Sometimes effort only gave them a better chance. In the wilderness, a better chance was often the most anyone got. And then there was the silence. Once the cabin held enough food to feel less immediately vulnerable, the mind had room to notice what the body had been too busy to name. Isolation settled differently in winter. In the building days, there had been noise. Axe blows, falling timber, the scrape of logs, the small urgent list of tasks that filled every waking thought. But once the walls stood, once the food hung in place and the daily routines grew familiar, a different pressure began to appear. The pressure of being alone with weather, sometimes for weeks, sometimes longer. A mountain man might see no one. Not a neighbor, not a trader, not a passing friend, just tracks of animals, shifting snow, and the long, patient companionship of his own thoughts. That kind of solitude is difficult for many people even now. And most of us, if we are honest, start reaching for distraction after about 7 seconds of quiet and half a sandwich. Out there was no such easy escape. The silence had structure. It lasted through morning chores, through long walks to the traps, through the first spoonful of stew, through the dying of the fire toward sleep. The cabin could feel like a sanctuary, and it could feel like a box, often both in the same hour. Some men, it seems, kept journals, notes on weather, on animal sign, on distance, on trade, on what they saw, and what they felt. I am glad some of them did. A written line in a lonely cabin is a small act of defiance against emptiness. Picture the scene. Firelight low but steady. The room smelling of smoke, hide, and stored food. A rough page opened on a knee or a crate. A hand stiff from cold wrapping itself around a pencil or pen. The scratching sounds small, almost timid, yet deeply human. Just a record. Snow all day. Trap empty at the creek. Wind from the north. Fire troublesome. Felt low in spirit by evening. Nothing grand. Just the truth pinned down before sleep. Other men may have talked aloud to themselves. I hope they did. Solitude can make a man inventive with companionship. A muttered complaint at the kettle. A comment addressed to the fire. A dry remark to the weather outside, as if the storm might finally be shamed into better behavior. There is a kind of humor that thrives only in hard conditions, small and grim and oddly cheerful. Not because anything is easy, but because a man must laugh somewhere or risk becoming as stiff as the icicles on his roof. And still, beneath those little defenses, loneliness had its own slow teeth. The mind would travel, back to towns once known, to a tavern full of voices, to family, if there was family, to a woman left behind, perhaps, or Weechen never found, to arguments remembered with unnecessary clarity, to foolish choices and brave ones, and the strange thin line between them. Winter has a way of making memory louder. There are fewer distractions in the room when the snow rises against the walls. If you were sitting there with me, by that rough hearth, you would hear how large the smallest sounds become in such a life. The pop of sap in a log, the shift of a hanging strip of meat, the faint tick of cooling stone, the wind rubbing a branch somewhere against the roof, boots drying by the fire, breath, spoon against a tin cup, the little noises of maintenance and waiting. They become companions, almost ceremonial in their repetition. And perhaps that is how some men endured the isolation best. By leaning into routine until routine itself became a shelter. Rise. Rekindle the fire. Check the wall seams. Eat. Gather wood. Visit the trap line. Return. Prepare food. Mend something. Write a line. Sleep. Repeat. There is real mercy in order when the outer world is disorderly and vast. A ritual does not make the mountains smaller, but it gives the hands something trustworthy to do. Some evenings, the loneliness would soften. A beautiful dusk over snow. Smoke rising straight because the air had gone perfectly still. The sky turning pale gold, then iron blue. The cabin warm enough for a little ease in the spine. In moments like that, the wilderness might feel not like an enemy, but like a stern old presence willing to tolerate the man within it. Other nights it would return to seeming endless and indifferent, a white country without witnesses. The mountain men lived in that tension constantly, prepared, but just never secure. Fed, but never far from hunger. Sheltered, but never fully beyond the weather. Alone, yet somehow woven into the habits of the land itself. And slowly, as winter deepened, The cabin became more than walls and stores and smoke. It became the center of a private world held together by labor, memory, and the stubborn refusal to give the cold everything it wanted. Tomorrow there would still be traps to check and food to stretch. Tomorrow the firewood pile would look insultingly smaller. Tomorrow the roof might need clearing after snow. But for tonight, with provisions hanging in the dimness and the fire lighting the room in amber pulses, the mountain man could sit among the results of his own foresight and feel, if not safe exactly, then steadier. And in the wilderness, steadiness was its own kind of blessing. He would know the stores by sight now, and perhaps more by instinct than sight. The heavier strip of smoked meat that should be left untouched another week. The small bundle of herbs worth saving for sickness, not appetite. The roots beginning to soften that ought to be used first. Hunger teaches an intimate mathematics, not the kind written on paper in neat columns, but the kind learned by lifting, weighing, rationing, and deciding which comfort can wait. This was part of winter, too, the narrowing of choices until wisdom looked very much like restraint. There may have been evenings when he ate more than he should have, simply because the body had been worked hard and the smell from the pot was too persuasive. I would not blame him. Survival stories sometimes pretend people remain perfectly disciplined under strain, but real human beings are rarely so tidy. A man tired from chopping wood in bitter air might look at an extra portion and decide that tomorrow's caution could take care of itself. Then, by morning, he would likely return to stricter judgment, stirred back into seriousness by the sight of the remaining stores and the long white season still stretched ahead. That constant balancing act between use and preservation, comfort and prudence, must have shaped the mind in small, relentless ways. It made every meal carry 2 times at once. The present hunger, the future hunger. A mouthful swallowed by the fire now. Another portion imagined weeks away when weather might trap him indoors. A simple stew could contain anxiety, gratitude, memory, and fatigue all at once. Perhaps that is why the cabin felt so dense by this stage of winter. Not crowded in a physical sense, unless furs, tools, and food had reduced the floor to a narrow path. Dense in meaning. Every object had consequence. Every crack had history. Every meal had calculation behind it. And every silence had to be lived through with enough steadiness that the mind did not begin inventing unnecessary shadows in the corners. By the middle stretch of winter, after enough mornings had begun in gray cold, and enough evenings had ended in the same circle of firelight, a subtle change would come over the mountain man and over the cabin itself. The frantic urgency of building had passed. The first desperate scramble to gather food, seal walls, and establish some order had become habit. Yet habit did not mean ease. It meant only that the work had moved deeper, into maintenance, into endurance, into the long conversation between a man and the shelter that kept him alive. A cabin in winter was never finished. That is one of the clearest truths in this whole story. A townhouse may permit the illusion of completion. A wilderness cabin rarely does. Snow found the roof. Wind probed the seams. Smoke insisted on its own opinions. The earth beneath the foundation shifted with freezing and thawing. Logs dried, settled, and sometimes shrank just enough to reopen the very cracks a man had packed days or weeks earlier. So each morning, after the fire and before any larger task, there was inspection. He would move slowly along the inside wall, not with panic. Not anymore, but with the practiced eye of someone who knew that little weaknesses become large at the worst possible time. The back of his hand might hover near the joints to feel for invisible cold moving in. Fingers would press at the chinking where it had dried, testing whether it still held. Eyes would follow the corners upward toward the roofline. A draft might reveal itself not through sight but through feeling, a faint thread of chill against the knuckles, a tiny wandering current over the neck. That was how winter entered. Not always with some dramatic blast, but with patience. Then the repairs began again. A bit more clay if clay remained workable. More moss stuffed into a stubborn seam. A wedge adjusted. A loose piece tightened. Roof edges checked after storms. Snow pushed down from the upper side if the weight looked troubling. It was slow work, repetitive work, and that repetition was the point. Surviving in the mountains was less often a single heroic act than a long chain of annoyingly necessary ones. The sort of tasks modern people abandon for a week and then call charming when photographed. Still, there could be a meditative calm in such labor once the hands learned it. The mountain man crouched by a wall, knife at his belt, a little bowl or bundle of patching material nearby, the fire making a low, steady sound at his back. Outside, the weather muttered through the trees. Inside, there was this small domain of attention. Press, smooth, check, move on. It is hard to panic while doing careful repair. The task keeps the fear from growing too grand. The roof, of course, remained an object of particular concern. Snow on a roof looks soft from a distance, but soft things become very serious when gathered in enough quantity. After heavy storms, the mountain man might step outside into air sharp enough to sting the lungs, lift his face toward the slope of the roof, and judge by instinct whether it carried too much. Then came the awkward climb. Boots uncertain on packed snow, gloves stiff, an arm full of caution. He would clear what he could, pushing the burden off in rough sheets, hearing it fall with muffled thumps around the cabin walls. A poor step, a hidden slick patch, one moment of haste, and the maintenance of shelter could become its own hazard. Such was frontier efficiency. Even the act of preventing one problem like to threaten another. And yet, once the roof was relieved and the walls patched, there came that particular inward comfort of a structure tended with care. A cabin does not love its occupant, but it can feel almost companionable when looked after properly. The mountain men understood this in practical terms. They sharpened tools, mended small breaks, checked hinges, replaced worn lashings, russet pegs. They were not simply living inside their shelter. They were in ongoing partnership with it. Perhaps that is why so many accounts of frontier solitude carry a strange warmth beneath their hardness. The man was alone. Yes, often profoundly so. But he was not idle inside that aloneness. His days were full of acts that affirmed his presence. A cut here, a patch there, a log shifted, a handle tightened, a pan blackened by repeated use hanging where his hand could find it even in dim light. These details mattered. They turned emptiness into habitation. Still, the mind had its long stretches to wander. By this stage of winter, the first novelty of isolation had long since worn thin. The silence no longer felt dramatic. It felt ordinary, which in some ways is harder. Grand loneliness can almost flatter a person. Ordinary loneliness just sits down beside him and stays. The mountain man would know every creak in the floor, every place where the wind teased the chimney, every hour when the light on the snow shifted from white to blue. Familiarity settled over everything, and with it came a quieter mental test. What do you do with your thoughts when there is no new voice to interrupt them? Some men answered with routine, as they always had. The same sequence of chores, the same measured walk to the traps, the same careful splitting of wood, the same evening meal near the hearth. Others answered with observation. They learned the moods of the weather in finer detail. The exact look of clouds before a fresh fall, the tone of wind that meant drifting snow by morning, the different tracks left in the white crust by rabbit, fox, deer, wolf. The wilderness, once it stopped feeling like one great blank danger, separated into patterns, and the man living there began to read them almost unconsciously. I think that reading became a form of companionship. Not soft companionship, not the easy warmth of conversation, but something real. The mountain man learned that the land did not speak in words and did not care for his comfort. Yet it was never entirely silent either. It told him things through small signs. A sudden hush in the trees, a faint cracking in the night from deeper frost, smoke refusing to rise cleanly because the air had changed, bird movement, animal absence, snow texture. Even the smell outside the door could shift, cleaner before a hard freeze, wetter before heavier weather. In such a life, noticing became a kind of intelligence and also a kind of solace. Inside the cabin, that same attentiveness shaped the smaller hours. He might sit after dark and sharpen a blade slowly on a stone, the rasping rhythm filling the room, or mend a torn glove, or scrape and soften part of a hide for some future use, or sort the remaining provisions with the sober arithmetic of winter. How much meat still hanging? How much root left in the cache? How long until he must trust the trap line more heavily again? The calculations were not abstract. They were tangible, touchable, hanging above him, or tucked under the bed frame, or packed in a corner where the cold stayed useful. Some scholars argue that frontier isolation produced a kind of hard independence nearly impossible for us to imagine now. Others suggest the reality was more uneven, that solitude could sharpen a man, but also warp him, dull him, or leave him vulnerable to deep melancholy. I suspect both are true. We cannot be entirely sure what passed through a given mountain man's mind in the last hour before sleep. Perhaps some felt strong in it. Perhaps others stared into the fire and missed the simple nuisance of ordinary conversation more than they would ever admit aloud. Honestly, I can understand that. You know that feeling when the quiet in a room stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling a little too aware of you. Multiply that by weather, by distance, by the knowledge that no friendly knock will come at the door unless chance has wandered very far from home. And yet there was freedom here, too. Real freedom. Not the bright decorative kind from speeches, but the harsher private kind. No town clock. No landlord. No one telling the mountain man when to wake, what to mend first, how much wood to cut, how long to sit in silence. The land made demands. Yes, but they were honest demands. Brutal sometimes. Unfair sometimes. But never petty. A man in the wilderness answered to weather, hunger, and his own abilities. For many mountain men, that harsh bargain was worth more than comfort elsewhere. On clearer days, he might step outside after chores and simply stand for a while. The snow around the cabin would glitter hard under pale light. Pines would hold their burdens without complaint. The air would be so cold it seemed to ring. There is a kind of beauty that only emerges when nothing in the landscape is trying to be beautiful. Just starkness. Clean lines. Breath rising. Distance layered in blue and white. In such moments, the loneliness could loosen its grip and become something more spacious, almost like reverence. Then a gust of wind would push powder off the roof down the back of his collar, and the reverence would become much more practical. That, too, belongs in the truth of it. A little humor, a little muttered irritation. The mountain men were not marble statues of endurance. They were people. They slipped, cursed, burned their fingers, overestimated a trap, underestimated a storm, got tired of smoked meat, got tired of their own thoughts, got tired of the weather behaving like weather. The grandeur of frontier life sits very close to its absurdity. That nearness is one reason it feels human. Inside again, with snow melting from his boots near the door, and the fire slowly reclaiming the room, the mountain man would resume the small empire of maintenance. A roof beam checked by eye, a hook adjusted, a line retied, water melted or fetched, meat cut thin for stew, herbs pinched and added. Perhaps he looked through the little opening that served as a window, if there was one, and saw only white drifts and dark trunks. Perhaps he watched twilight come on early and felt that familiar inward drawing, the sense that once again the world had narrowed to this room, this glow, this one human pulse inside the weather. By late winter, a man might know his cabin almost as he knew his own body. This log always clicked as it cooled. That corner gathered draft in hard north wind. The stones at the hearth held warmth longest after the fire burned down. The shelf above the bed frame caught a little soot. The door stuck after heavy damp and loosened again in bitter, dry cold. Such knowledge sounds small, but it is not small when your life depends on the room behaving as expected. And as that knowledge deepened, so did the strange emotional life of the place. The cabin might once have been only a project, then a refuge, then a workplace. Now it became memory itself. Every mark in the wood pointed to labor already spent. The notch cut on that freezing morning. The patch in the wall from the storm in January. The blackened stone from a pot tipped too close to flame. The peg where the best knife hung. These details tied the man to the place with more than utility. They made the cabin a witness. Night after night, the same pattern returned. Fire lowered. The world outside disappeared into darkness. The roof ticked softly in the cold. The smell of smoke settled into blanket, beard, glove, sleeve. A journal line, perhaps. A prayer, perhaps. Though not every man prayed, and not every prayer used sacred words. Sometimes a prayer is only a hope spoken quietly into embers. Let the roof hold. Let tomorrow's traps bring something. Let the storm pass wide. Let sleep be deep and undisturbed. By then the mountain man would know that winter was less a battle than a season of continual bargains. He gave labor and received one more day of shelter. He gave attention and received a little more warmth. He gave patience and received the chance to remain whole inside such isolation. Nothing was free. Yet, not everything was cruel either. There was peace here, real peace, but it had to be noticed while doing the work, not after the work ended, because the work never truly ended. Soon enough, the season would begin to tilt almost imperceptibly. Light lingering a little longer. Snow changing texture. Water whispering under ice where before there had been only silence. But that is later. For now the cabin still stands in the deep of winter, cared for with obsessive steadiness, held together by clay, wood, stone, smoke, and a bit. And inside it a man sits close to the fire, hearing the wind test the walls once more, knowing the walls will answer because he has taught them how. Tomorrow he will rise again. He will clear, mend, inspect, measure, carry, cut, cook, and wait. He will continue the old work of keeping a small square of warmth alive in the middle of a great, indifferent cold. And in that careful persistence, in that refusal to let the wilderness have the final word, he will discover what so many mountain men discovered before him. Survival is not only strength. It is attention. It is patience. It is the quiet art of remaining. There were likely nights when the mind resisted all this wisdom. Nights when the fire burned poorly, when sleep would not settle, when some old memory arrived with enough force to make the walls feel suddenly too close. In those hours the cabin could change character again. The same room that held safety could seem to hold every unspoken thought as well. A hanging strip of meat becomes a shape in dim light. A shifting roof beam sounds almost like a footstep. The wilderness presses near without entering, and the imagination, underfed or overtired, begins trying to decorate the dark. That is why the small certainties mattered. Touching the rifle where it leaned, feeling the heat still stored in the stones, hearing the familiar dry rattle of a pan hook when the fire settled, looking up and seeing the same arrangement of rafters, smoke stains, pegs, and shadow. The mountain man did not defeat loneliness once and for all. He managed it. He kept it from becoming larger than the room. He met it with routine, with work, with a little humor, with memory. and with the stubborn practical fact that morning would come and demand useful things from him, whether his heart felt light or not. The deep stretch of winter had taught the mountain man nearly everything except mercy. By now he knew how the roof sounded under fresh snow, how the walls answered a hard wind, how long the embers could be trusted before dawn, how empty a trapline could look even after a careful day of setting it. He knew the habits of the cabin so well that his hand could find a tool in dim firelight before his eyes fully managed it. And still, for all that knowledge, the work remained unfinished each morning. That was the final lesson of a wilderness cabin. It was never done. The storm might pass in the night and leave the world outside polished in white silence, almost beautiful enough to make a man suspicious. Or it might keep muttering through the dark, pushing drifts higher against the wall, laying fresh weight across the roof, reminding him with every long breath of wind that timber and clay were only ever an argument against the season, never a victory over it. So he rose once more, fed the hearth once more, and moved through the same small kingdom of necessary tasks with the patience of someone who understood that impatience was a luxury best enjoyed elsewhere. The first look was always upward. Even from inside, he could sometimes sense what the roof had endured. A heavier hush overhead, a different groan in the beams, the soft sliding whisper of packed snow shifting down one side. He would stand still and listen, not dramatically, not with panic, but with that steady interior measuring that winter teaches so well. Then came the boots, the gloves, the opening of the door, and the immediate bite of outside air against the face. There is a very particular cold after a storm. Clean, sharp, almost shining in the lungs. The sky often clears into a pale, hard blue, and the world looks newly made, though of course it is not new at all. It is just buried. The cabin stands at the center of that stillness, smoke rising if the fire has been fed well, snow banked around the walls, the roof carrying whatever burden the night has placed upon it. The mountain man steps out into this white hush and sees the truth plainly. If he does not tend to the shelter now, the shelter will not tend to him later. So he climbs. Carefully, always carefully, even if he has done it 10 times before. Snow on a roof is not merely snow. It is weight and slickness and bad surprises hidden under brightness. He tests the pitch with each step, shifts his balance, plants the tool, pushes, clears, pushes again. Great soft slabs tumble down with muted thumps, breaking apart in sprays of powder. Sometimes the snow comes away easily, almost helpfully. Sometimes it clings as if personally offended by the request. He keeps working regardless, breath moving out in white bursts, shoulders warming with exertion despite the cold. If you were standing below, you would hear little sounds that no one writes into heroic histories. The scuff of boots, the scrape of wood against packed snow, a small grunt when a heavier drift resists, a muttered remark when powder slips inside the collar. Frontier life had its noble moments, certainly, but it also contained a great many unglamorous negotiations with gravity and weather. Once the roof has been relieved, he drops back to the ground and circles the cabin, slowly. This, too, is part of the ritual. The storm may have left more than snow behind. A loosened seam, a shifted patch of chinking, moisture where it should not be. The lower logs near the foundation inspected with a careful eye. The door checked. The corners checked. The chimney watched for any sign that the last burn has laid soot where draft once moved cleanly. Nothing is assumed safe for long. Assumptions in the mountains have a poor record. Then the repairs begin again, though now there is less frustration in them than there once was. The work has become too familiar to inspire outrage every time. He knows the texture of the patching clay in cold hands. He knows how moss behaves when pressed into a narrow seam. He knows which side of the cabin takes the worst wind and which corner likes to pretend it is secure until the temperature drops cruelly at night. The structure has revealed its character by now. Like a person after enough shared hardship, it is difficult, useful, and oddly knowable. I think that is why the cabin begins to feel almost alive at this stage. Not literally. Of course, the beams do not love him back. The walls are not sentimental. But the place has moods. It settles differently in dry cold than in wet. It speaks through creaks, drafts, the draw of smoke, the holding of warmth. The mountain man reads those signals the way he reads tracks in snow. With practice, with respect, with the knowledge that misreading them is expensive. And while he keeps the cabin standing, the cabin in turn keeps his days from breaking apart into emptiness. There were still traps to check, of course. Firewood to cut, food to stretch. But maintenance had become its own deep occupation, almost a philosophy made of chores. A man living so far from help cannot leave problems in a neat little pile labeled later. Later is where small failures go to become dangerous. So he fixes the loose peg. He resets the stone that shifted by the hearth. He sharpens the axe before it grows dull enough to steal unnecessary strength from the arm. He mends the tear in a glove, while the tear is still a nuisance and not yet an injury. This constant attention, this refusal to let things decay unattended, shaped the mind as much as the cabin. It taught a kind of humility. A beam can crack. A knife can dull. A body can tire. A storm can return tomorrow, no matter how beautifully the sunset glows tonight. Yet it also taught competence. Not the loud, swaggering kind. The quieter kind that knows how to proceed when something goes wrong. Tighten that. Patch this. Clear that. Feed the fire. Try again. Honestly, there is something deeply soothing in that kind of competence. It leaves less room for useless drama. Outside, winter still ruled everything. The mountains had not grown kinder. Animals remained wary. Hunger still sat close to the edge of each plan. But inside the orbit of the cabin, the mountain man had made a small order of things. The tools had their places. The woodpile had its logic. The stores had their sequence. Even the trapline, with all its frequent disappointments, had become part of a greater map in his mind. He knew which path drifted worst after snow, which stream edge iced first, which section of woods often carried rabbit sign, which stretch of ground felt unlucky in a way that was probably practical but came to feel personal. Then came the quieter hours. Evening after repairs had its own softness. Not softness in the sense of ease, but in the sense of edges briefly relaxing. The fire built back up after a day of labor. Damp gloves turned and warmed. A simple meal stirred. The room glowed amber against the blue dark pressing outside. In those moments, the cabin looked less like a project and more like a settled fact. A hard-won pocket of human order holding its shape in a country that would erase it if neglected. He might sit and study the walls without really meaning to. That seam there was repacked after the north wind in early winter. The roof beam above the hearth smoked a little the first week and then learned better. The door peg had been remade from a scrap of oak after the first one split. The marks of labor were everywhere now, and because they were everywhere, they ceased to feel like blemishes. They felt like biography. Some men probably spoke aloud in such hours. Not from madness, from proportion. A little voice in a small room can keep the silence from becoming too large. A complaint to the kettle, a joke at the weather's expense, a dry comment about a trap that had once again failed in its modest responsibilities. I suspect frontier humor was often the kind that would not impress polite company, and would therefore be all the better for it. There were nights, too, when the mind moved beyond humor into reflection. The mountain man would look at the cabin around him and understand, perhaps more clearly than before, that survival had not come from one grand gesture, not from bravery in a single shining moment. It had come from repetition, from getting up, from noticing, from keeping small failures small, from returning again and again to the plain work that made the next day possible. That is a less glamorous truth than many legends prefer, but it is a stronger one. The mountain men did not merely defy the wilderness. Over time, they adjusted themselves to its tempo. They learned when to push and when to wait. They learned that some storms are better listened to than challenged. They learned that a full woodpile can soothe fear more effectively than a bold speech. They learned that a dry cabin, a decent fire, and enough food for another week amount to a form of wealth more convincing than anything jingling in a pocket. And perhaps, by this point in the winter, the mountain man had begun to feel something else as well. Not comfort exactly. Comfort is too easy a word. But belonging, a difficult, narrow kind of belonging, earned through labor rather than granted by welcome. The mountains were still vast. The cold still ruthless. The solitude still real. Yet he had learned the place well enough that it no longer felt entirely foreign. He knew where the snow drifted deepest. He knew how the light crossed the clearing late in the day. He knew the sounds of his own shelter and the moods of the weather around it. In a world so large, such knowledge becomes a kind of home. Tomorrow there would still be repairs. There always would. More snow, perhaps. Another weak seam. Another trap to reset. Another armload of wood to carry in with aching shoulders. But tonight the cabin stands because he has kept it standing. The roof bears only what it should. The walls hold. The hearth breathes steadily. Outside, the wilderness waits with all its old indifference. Inside, there is warmth, order, and the low, satisfying quiet of things maintained well enough to last another night. And as the fire settles deeper into its bed of coals, The mountain man understands something that cannot be hurried and cannot be borrowed. A cabin in winter is not built once. It is built daily, by care, by repetition, by the refusal to look away from small weaknesses. It is held together not only by logs and clay, but by attention, by patience, by the strange enduring calm that comes when a man stops asking whether the work is finished and begins accepting that the work itself is the way he remains alive. The wind will rise again. The cold will press in again. Snow will return with its blank, relentless face. Yet for now, the cabin answers, all of it with the quiet authority of something tended properly. The mountain man sits near the hearth, feeling heat stored in stone and wood, and lets the room rest around him. No triumph, no speech, just the simple dignity of endurance, which in such a place is more than enough. At some point, almost too slowly to notice, winter begins to loosen one careful finger at a time. Not enough to trust. Never that. The mountains do not surrender their season with any theatrical flourish. They simply shift. Light lingers a little longer on the snow. The air at noon carries the faintest suggestion of softness before turning sharp again by evening. Water can sometimes be heard beneath the ice. Not loudly, just a hidden whisper under the frozen crust of things. A roof that only yesterday held dry powder may now release a dripping sound in the afternoon sun. The cabin remains what it has always been. Hearth, wall, roof, vigilance. But the world beyond it is beginning, cautiously, to move. The mountain man notices these changes not because he is sentimental, but because by now he notices everything. He steps outside in the morning and the clearing feels different. Still white, still cold, still capable of treachery, but altered. The sky has a slightly higher look to it. The pines cast longer, clearer shadows. The snow underfoot is not quite the same dry complaint it made at the heart of winter. It gives a little differently. The air smells faintly changed, too, less like iron and more like wet bark and distant thaw. Tiny things, easy to miss if a person lives elsewhere among clocks and walls and busy voices. Impossible to miss if a person's life depends on the habits of weather. And the mountain man, Binau, belongs to that second category. This is where the story turns quietly, and I like that it does. Not with some triumphant march into spring, not with a grand declaration that the wilderness has been conquered. Nothing so theatrical. The mountains remain themselves. The cabin remains a necessity. The work remains daily and real. But something in the man has changed across these long winter weeks. He is no longer merely enduring a place that tests him. He has learned its pace. He has been shaped by it, perhaps even steadied by it. The traps still need checking. Firewood still matters. Repairs still appear with that familiar frontier confidence. A wet seam here, a roof edge there, stores to be judged, tools to be kept in order. Yet the work now feels less like resistance and more like participation. That, I think, is one of the deepest truths in the mountain men's story. They did not survive by defeating the land. They survived by adjusting themselves until their lives could move with its demands. If you were sitting here beside me by the fire, you might hear the difference in the cabin, too. The walls hold the warmth more easily now because the days are not quite so merciless. The hearth still matters, always, but the fear of waking to absolute killing cold has softened by a degree. The room smells of old smoke, seasoned wood, dried stores, worn leather, and the faint earthiness of thaw returning in secret from below. There is history in the air. Not the history of kings or armies, but of repeated, ordinary acts done well enough to keep life going. Chopped wood, reset traps, repaired seams, carefully measured meals, a roof cleared before collapse, a fire fed before dawn. The cabin remembers all of it. Every mark in the timber carries labor. Every patch in the wall carries some earlier storm inside it. The man can look around now and read the room as if it were a journal written in wood grain, soot, and clay. That notch was cut in bitter wind. That shelf was added on a calmer afternoon. That blackened stone by the hearth still holds the ghost of an overboiled pot. These things would mean nothing to a stranger. To the man who lived them, they are the shape of winter itself. And here, near the end of the long season, another feeling begins to rise. Pride, perhaps, though not the loud sort. It is quieter than that, more private. The pride of having made a life hold in a place where failure always stood nearby. He did not build a palace. He did not create comfort in the ordinary sense. But he made warmth where there was cold. He made order where there was wilderness. He made continuity where there might easily have been an ending. That matters. The mountain men are sometimes remembered only as rough figures in buckskin, half myth, half weather-stained, wandering through a dramatic landscape. Yet inside the truth of their cabins there was something more intimate. They cooked. They repaired. They waited. They counted stores. They listened to storms. They endured loneliness. They watched light change on snow and learned to read the day by the feel of the air on their face. Their greatness, if we can call it that, was not that they escaped hardship. It was that they built a way to live inside it. Some scholars would argue that these men were never entirely alone in the grand romantic way later generations imagined. They traded. They crossed paths with others. They relied, directly or indirectly, on knowledge already present in the land. That is worth remembering. The wilderness was never an empty stage waiting for a dramatic entrance. It was already full of paths, histories, danger, and wisdom. The mountain man's cabin, however solitary it felt in a given winter, belonged to a larger human story. It is better and more honest to say that he joined that story in a particularly exposed way. By now, though, exposure has become familiarity. The man steps out after a storm and no longer sees only threat. He sees signs. Which drift will melt first? Where the animal paths may reopen. Whether the stream by the lower bank has begun to breathe beneath its lid of ice. He can tell, from the way smoke rises or flattens, what the wind will probably do by afternoon. The land is still stern, but it is no longer unreadable. There is deep comfort in that sort of knowledge. He gathers wood, Perhaps not with the panic that drove him in the first heavy cold, but with the same necessary steadiness. He checks the traps, knowing some will be empty, knowing that emptiness is part of the arrangement. He returns to the cabin and feels what every winter survivor must eventually feel. That the place which once seemed so rough and provisional has become inseparable from his own body. He knows how many steps from hearth to door in darkness. He knows which board or plank will complain under his weight. He knows where the fire catches quickest and where the smoke likes to linger when the air outside is wrong. The cabin has become an extension of his habits, and his habits have become the architecture of his survival. I have always found that deeply beautiful, not in a polished way, not in the way a travel brochure would understand beauty, more in the way a worn hand tool is beautiful after years of use, fitted to purpose, marked by effort, quietly dependable. There were probably evenings near the end of winter when the mountain man sat a little longer than usual by the hearth, not because the work had vanished, but because he could finally feel what that work had made. Outside, dusk lowering over snowfields tinged pink and blue. Inside, amber light moving over the walls. A pot warming gently. Boots near the fire. A hide hanging still. The room close and known and sufficient. In such a moment, the whole season might gather itself into one understanding. I am still here. That sentence carries more weight in the wilderness than it does almost anywhere else. And still, the humility remains. The mountain man knows better now than to trust the mountains too quickly. Late storms can still arrive. A thaw can still rot old snow into dangerous slickness. Supplies still need care. Fire still needs feeding. If he has learned peace, it is not the peace of certainty. It is the peace of readiness. A peace made of sharpened tools, dry wood, steady habits, and the refusal to grow careless just because the light has softened. The mountain men who built these cabins left behind more than structures. They left behind a pattern of thought, a way of meeting difficulty without excess drama, a way of reading the land with respect instead of fantasy, a way of understanding that real endurance is built from small acts repeated faithfully. Their cabins were simple, yes, sometimes smoky, often cramped, probably colder than anyone would willingly choose. But they held something immense inside their rough walls. The proof that a human being, with enough patience and enough skill, could create a pocket of life in a place that seemed to offer none freely. And maybe that is why these cabins still linger in the imagination. They are not merely historical objects. They are symbols of a very old human hope. Build well enough. Prepare carefully enough. Pay attention closely enough. And perhaps you may endure what would otherwise swallow you. Night comes on again, as it always does. The clearing dims. The trees become dark shapes against a sky slowly filling with stars. The last cold light withdraws from the snow and leaves it silver, then blue, then nearly black in the deeper shadows. Inside, the fire burns with a calmer certainty than it did in those first uncertain nights. The mountain man moves through his cabin with practiced ease. One last check of the door. One glance at the roofline through the dimness. A small adjustment to the wood on the hearth. A simple meal finished or waiting. The room breathing quietly around him. The wilderness outside has not changed its nature. It remains vast, indifferent, beautiful, and dangerous all at once. But the man inside the cabin has changed. He has learned its sounds, its tempers, its silence. He has learned how to meet its demands without pleading for softness. He has learned that survival is not a bright, dramatic thing. It is low firelight. It is boots drying near stone. It is smoke in old timber. It is hunger managed, fear reduced to tasks, loneliness carried with dignity, and day after day of useful work done before despair can grow theatrical. And now, at the close of the long winter story, he sits near the hearth and lets the warmth rest against him. The cabin holds. The walls stand. The roof bears what it must. The stores, though reduced, have done their work. The tools wait for tomorrow. Outside, the snow lies over the mountains in deep, patient silence. And somewhere beneath it all, water is beginning to move again. He can hear the faintest shift in the season if he listens closely enough. Not a promise, not an ending, just a change. The old struggle will continue in one form or another. It always does. There will be more wood to cut, more weather to read, more repairs to make, more distances to cross. Yet something lasting has already been made here. A life, a rhythm, a refuge. The mountain men who first raised cabins in those wild places built more than shelter from the cold. They built proof that a person could dwell, however roughly, in the heart of the untamed and find not just survival, but a stern and quiet form of peace. So the fire lowers. The shadows soften. The wind moves lightly through the trees beyond the walls, no longer howling, only passing by like an old thought. And inside the cabin, in that final calm earned through labor and patience and many nights of endurance, the mountain man closes his eyes, warm for the moment, held by the work of his own hands, and lets the wilderness remain what it is while he rests within it. Good night.